Woodbridge Farms Stone Soup. Once upon a time, a very wise man named Mr. Danziger traveled from a land far away in the east until he came across the small school community of Woodbridge Farms. It was a peaceful place where everyone knew each other, took care of each other, and treated each other like family. At least, that's how it had once been. At the time of Mr. Danziger's arrival, however, the people had gone through some difficult years and they had forgotten how to trust and support each other. To make matters worse, people from outside the farm had been stealing vegetables from the Woodbridge gardens, and the Woodbridge citizens had built a tall fence to keep strangers out. Mr. Danziger was weary and hungry and hoping to share a meal and some happy times with the people of this lovely community. He proactively approached each door in the school to ask the citizens to share with him, but they were very cautious and hesitant to trust him. "No, we have nothing to share with you," they said. One door after another was closed until Mr. Danziger finally understood. How sad, he thought. These people have forgotten how to trust, and they have forgotten how to share. I fear that they've forgotten the 7 habits. I must help them. Deep in thought, Mr. Danziger wandered through the community until he came to a beautiful red bridge that spanned a sparkling pond. He leaned on the rail of the bridge and, beginning with the end in mind, tried to come up with a solution to the problem as he gazed at the ducks and reeds and stones around the edge of the pond. Stones! Suddenly he had an idea. He went to the edge of the pond and picked up 2 smooth, round stones. He smiled, put the stones in his pockets, and headed back to the school. Mr. Danziger went to the kindergarten room and borrowed a large pot from Mrs. Nagy, because Mrs. Nagy had everything in her room, and she was always willing to share, even with strangers. He took it to the school kitchen, filled it with water, and set it to boil. When the water was bubbling, he dropped the 2 stones into it. He concentrated carefully and stirred the stones with great care. Before long, 3 curious students stopped to see what he was doing. "What are you doing?" asked Natasha. "I'm making stone soup," answered Mr. Danziger. "Doesn't it smell wonderful?" Isaac moved closer and smelled the boiling water. "What's in the soup?" he asked. 2 perfect round stones," said Mr. Danziger. He leaned closer to him and whispered, "Don't tell anyone. That's my secret ingredient." Emmy frowned. "Soup from a stone? That's impossible," she declared. Mr. Danziger smiled at her and answered, "It's the very best kind of soup. Of course, it is a bit better with an onion or 2, but since no one seems to have anything to share, well, this will do just fine. Soon, we'll have a wonderful feast for everyone." The children looked at each other. They were members of the school's garden team, and they knew where to get some lovely onions. But should they? Could they trust what he was saying? Finally, Isaac shrugged and said, "Well, I might be able to find you a few onions." The other girls nodded, and they ran out to the garden to pick some of the school onions for him. A while later, the onions were in the soup, and a delicious smell was spreading through the school. Mr. Danziger stirred the soup carefully and happily. Soon, more curious people began to gather to see what he was doing. "What are you making?" asked Mrs. Berg. "Stone soup," said Mr. Danziger. "Doesn't it smell delicious? It would even be better with some carrots, but even as it is, it would make a wonderful feast for all of us." "You're going to share this soup with everyone?" asked Mrs. Berg in surprise. "Of course! Stone soup is too good to keep to myself," exclaimed Mr. Danziger. Mrs. Berg went off, but was soon back with some carrots from the school garden. "Well, thank you for sharing," said Mr. Danziger cheerfully. "Nice to see you thinking win-win. Now, if only we had some potatoes. But that's okay. It'll be delicious just as it is." Miss Dragonoff said, "Weren't the kids growing potatoes in the garden? I'm sure we can share some of those." And off she went to get potatoes to add to the soup. Word spread quickly through the school. "Stone soup! A feast for all of us! If we all bring one small thing, it will be even better. Should we join? Should we trust? Should we work together and give what we have to make the soup better for all of us?" Gradually, the people of Woodbridge Farms relaxed and put their fears and worries aside. As they had in the old days, they talked excitedly together, brought whatever they had, and began to work to make the best soup ever. "Well, I believe I saw celery in the garden," offered Mrs. Watt. "I'll get it," said Isla from grade 1 2B. "But don't you have paperwork to do in the office, Mrs. Watt? Remember, put first things first." "I'll get peppers," said Cashton, running off to pick some for the soup. Ron announced, "We grew a new vegetable this year called kohlrabi. I'll get some and we can try that in the soup too." The soup smelled better and better, and most of the school had now crowded into the hallway to see what was going on. Mrs. Davies pushed through the crowd and took a deep breath. "Oh, that smells good," she exclaimed. "May I have a taste?" Mr. Danziger held out a spoon. "Be my guest." Mrs. Davies tasted a spoonful, tilted her head, and frowned a little. The crowd held its breath and leaned forward to hear what she would pronounce. "Ooh, this is wonderful soup, but it needs a little extra something. Were they growing any herbs in the garden this year?" "Yes, there's basil and parsley," answered Amber Dancy. "I'll go and get some." "I found some salt and pepper," said Connor McPhee. "And I found some garlic," said Emily Darter. "Thank you for synergizing," said Mr. Danziger. "I think our soup is almost ready for us to share." "I think we should move this party to the gym," suggested Miss Carruthers. "I'll find bowls," said Mrs. Whittaker. "I'll bring spoons," offered Mrs. Tannehill. "Let's assemble," declared Mrs. Watt, who had finished her paperwork and was now ready to join in. The teachers organized their classes and headed for the gym. Mr. Danziger brought the pot of soup and set it on a table at the front of the gym. "Before we eat, let's hear a story from Mrs. Davies," suggested Mr. Danziger. Mrs. Davies gave him a huge smile. Stories had always drawn the citizens of Woodbridge Farms together, and this was the sign they needed to know for sure that they were a family once again. She took the story of Stone Soup from Mrs. Sargent and shared it with the Woodbridge Farms community. It was wonderful, as always. Then everyone was given a bowl and a spoon, and they all sharpened their saws as they shared in a feast of the nutritious Woodbridge Farms Stone Soup. Soup from a stone. The best! And the rest of the week together in a way that hadn't happened in a long, long time. They decided to keep the gate to the garden unlocked. If someone from outside the farm really needs a little food, we can share what we have. As the day was coming to an end, Mrs. Watt spoke to the assembly. "On behalf of all of us, thank you, Mr. Danziger. You've reminded us that when we all give a little, we all gain a lot. Sharing is definitely caring." And the community of Woodbridge Farms lived happily ever after.